For decades, the middle class represented something powerful: stability, security, the belief that if ordinary people worked hard enough, life would slowly improve over time. A home, savings, children, retirement, not luxury, just stability. And for a long time, millions of people believed that future was normal. But slowly, something started changing underneath the surface. At first, almost nobody noticed it, because the decline didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, year after year, decade after decade. Homes became more expensive, debt became normal, savings became harder. And slowly, the financial pressure that once mostly affected poor households started spreading directly into the middle class itself. Today, millions of people who technically earn middle-class incomes still feel financially trapped. They work constantly, but struggle to build wealth. They earn more money on paper than previous generations, yet somehow feel less financially secure than their parents did decades ago. And that contradiction became one of the defining stories of the modern economy. Because the middle class didn't suddenly disappear, it slowly got squeezed from every direction at the same time. Housing, inflation, debt, healthcare, education, living costs, everything kept getting more expensive, while wages increasingly struggled to keep up. And eventually, many ordinary people started realizing something uncomfortable. Working harder no longer guaranteed moving forward financially the way it once did. That realization changed society more than most people understand. Because the middle class was never just about income. It was about stability, confidence, long-term security, the ability to believe the future would improve over time. And once that stability weakens, entire societies begin changing psychologically. People delay marriage, delay children, delay home ownership, delay retirement. Not because ambition disappeared, but because financial pressure leaves very little room for mistakes anymore. One emergency, one medical bill, one layoff, one economic downturn, and years of financial progress can suddenly collapse very quickly. That constant pressure created anxiety throughout society, and many younger generations increasingly feel like they are running harder just to maintain the same standard of living their parents once achieved more easily. That feeling is not imaginary, because over the last several decades, the relationship between wages and asset prices changed dramatically. Wages continued growing slowly, but assets exploded upward much faster. Homes, stocks, land, investments, and the people who already owned those assets became significantly wealthier over time. While people trying to enter later increasingly faced much higher barriers, that's one of the biggest reasons modern inequality feels so different now, because wealth increasingly comes from ownership, not simply from working harder. And once asset prices rise faster than wages for long enough, the gap between owners and non-owners widens continuously. That slowly changes the structure of society itself. A generation ago, many middle-class families could realistically buy homes in their 20s or 30s. Today, in many cities, even highly educated professionals struggle to afford basic housing without massive debt. That shift changes entire financial life trajectories, because home ownership historically became one of the primary ways ordinary families built long-term wealth. But when home ownership becomes increasingly difficult, wealth accumulation slows for huge portions of society. And once that happens, debt often fills the gap instead. Credit cards, student loans, car payments, 30-year mortgages, buy now, pay later systems. The middle class increasingly became dependent on financing simply to maintain ordinary life. And the more debt expanded, the more fragile financial stability became underneath the surface. Because debt creates pressure. Pressure creates dependency, and dependency reduces flexibility. A household carrying enormous monthly obligations cannot absorb economic shocks easily. One interruption in income suddenly becomes dangerous. That's why financial stress became widespread, even among people earning what once would have been considered strong middle-class salaries. Because many people are no longer simply paying for survival today. They are paying for obligations attached to years of future income already committed in advance. That creates a completely different psychological environment from previous generations. And technology accelerated this transformation even further. Modern life became optimized around consumption. Advertising became more sophisticated. Social media normalized luxury lifestyles constantly, and financing became frictionless. Everything became available instantly. Phones, cars, furniture, vacations. Entire economies increasingly shifted toward immediate consumption, supported by long-term payments. And the middle class became one of the primary engines driving that consumption. But there's another reason the middle class feels increasingly squeezed. Inflation. Not temporary inflation alone, but long-term asset inflation specifically. Because when interest rates stay low for long periods of time, asset prices often rise dramatically. Stocks rise, real estate rises, investments rise. And the people who already own assets benefit enormously from that expansion. But people relying mainly on wages often fall further behind instead. That's one reason many younger workers feel like they are chasing a moving target financially. Even when salaries increase, housing prices often rise faster, rent rises faster, living expenses rise faster. And eventually, people start feeling like they can never quite catch up no matter how hard they work. That creates frustration throughout society, because expectations and reality begin separating further apart. Many people were raised believing that education, discipline, and hard work would naturally lead to stability. But modern economies increasingly reward ownership more than labor itself. That changes everything. Because if wages struggle to keep pace while assets keep inflating, the middle class slowly weakens underneath the surface, even if economies appear healthy overall. Stock markets may rise, corporate profits may rise, GDP may grow, but ordinary households can still feel increasing financial pressure simultaneously. That contradiction confuses many people. Because economic growth does not always distribute benefits evenly across society. And over time, large portions of the middle class increasingly started relying on debt simply to preserve lifestyles that previous generations maintained more comfortably without it. That's an extremely important shift, because debt can temporarily create the appearance of stability. People can continue consuming, continue spending, continue maintaining lifestyles, even while underlying financial security weakens quietly underneath. But eventually, debt itself becomes another source of pressure, especially when interest rates rise, because higher rates increase borrowing costs across almost everything. Mortgages become more expensive, car loans become more expensive, credit card balances become heavier, and suddenly financial pressure spreads rapidly across the middle class again. But perhaps the biggest psychological change is this. The middle class once represented confidence in the future. Now many ordinary people increasingly feel uncertainty instead. Can they afford homes? Can they retire safely? Can they raise children comfortably? Can they survive emergencies? Those questions now dominate financial life much more than they once did. And when large portions of society lose confidence in long-term stability, the emotional consequences become enormous. Anxiety rises, trust weakens, social division grows stronger. Because stable middle classes historically helped create social balance inside economies. They represented the space between extreme poverty and extreme wealth. But once that middle space starts shrinking, societies often become more polarized financially and emotionally over time. And much of this happened so gradually that many people barely noticed the transformation while it was unfolding. Each year alone felt manageable. A slightly higher rent, a slightly larger debt payment, a slightly more expensive home. But over decades, those pressures compounded massively together, and eventually millions of ordinary people started feeling financially exhausted despite participating in economies supposedly growing stronger overall. That disconnect became one of the defining emotional experiences of modern economic life, because many people no longer feel like the system is helping them build stability. Instead, they increasingly feel like they are struggling just to avoid falling backward. That changes behavior dramatically. People become more cautious, more stressed, less optimistic, and financially exhausted populations often focus more on short-term survival than long-term wealth building. Meanwhile, the wealthy often benefit disproportionately from rising asset prices because they already own appreciating assets at large scale: real estate, stocks, businesses, land. So while rising asset prices create pressure for ordinary households, they often generate enormous wealth gains for existing owners simultaneously. That accelerates wealth concentration over time. And once ownership becomes concentrated heavily enough, society increasingly separates into different economic realities. One group survives mainly through labor. Another group increasingly grows wealth through ownership. That divide quietly reshapes entire economies underneath the surface. Because ownership compounds wealth differently than wages do. Assets appreciate, investments grow, equity expands. Meanwhile, wages often rise much slower. That's why many people feel trapped despite working constantly. Because labor alone increasingly struggles to compete with large-scale ownership accumulation over long periods of time. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that much of this pressure remains invisible until economic crises expose it suddenly. Recessions reveal fragile savings. Layoffs reveal debt dependence. Inflation exposes how vulnerable household budgets already became underneath the surface. And each crisis tends to widen pressure further between asset owners and financially vulnerable households. That's why the middle class matters so much historically, because strong middle classes create stability, economic resilience, long-term optimism, social balance. But when middle classes weaken for long enough, entire societies begin feeling unstable emotionally and economically. And many of the tensions visible across modern societies today are connected to that pressure directly or indirectly. Housing frustration, debt anxiety, economic hopelessness, financial exhaustion. Much of it connects back to the feeling that stable middle-class life is becoming increasingly difficult to reach or maintain. And if that trend continues long enough, societies may eventually split more aggressively between ownership and dependency, between asset holders and perpetual renters, between financial security and permanent instability. Because underneath all the complexity, the middle class was never only about money. It represented the belief that ordinary people could participate meaningfully in economic progress. And once enough people begin losing faith in that idea, entire societies start changing in ways far deeper than economics alone. In the next episode, we'll explore another hidden force quietly reshaping the modern world. How wealth itself became increasingly concentrated into fewer hands over time, and why the gap between ordinary people and the ultra-wealthy continues expanding faster than most realize.